was a activist who was a little bit of a different kind of activist. He was one of the founders of Mizrahi Hafla Mizrahi in the United States. He was also one of the founders of one of the yeshivas in Queens when there was, it's called YCQ, Yeshiva Central Queens. So still around today. I learned a lot about him dedicating his life, and it's also sort of ironic that Rabbi Weiss mentioned Meir Kahana, because I happen to be, Meir Kahana is a Brooklyn guy as well, and as he was beginning to start his mission in reaction to a whole bunch of other stuff that was happening, a generation that was awakening from the, beginning to awaken from the silence of the Holocaust. The children of the Holocaust survivors who are now becoming teenagers were trying to figure out how they were going to fashion themselves and figure themselves into a world living in huge Jewish communities. Brooklyn today has over 500,000 Jews. Vast majority are Haredim. Back then, the vast majority were secular. They were what we call Roosevelt Jews, not particularly connected to halachic Judaism, but very connected to being Jewish. What we call Roosevelt Judaism. They believed in America. They believed that America was the pathway to them achieving a certain connectivity to safety and to a society that, the first society in literally thousands of years that had welcomed them in and gave them an avenue to connection. And I was kidding around when I grew up. I didn't grow up particularly religious. We had a couple of holidays. We had Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, because you just had that. I don't think we went to synagogue, but we had that. We hung around outside. And then there was certainly Hanukkah, and certainly Passover. And then there was Election Day. Election Day was a very important day because that's the day you voted, and that was your expression of your connectivity to what America had to offer us, and that we were able to participate in that. But when I was in high school in Brooklyn, we were certainly encountering two movements at that point in time. One of the most profound movements we were encountering was certainly the civil rights movement, as Rabbi Weiss mentioned before, and black militarism that sort of grew up after 1964, the March on Washington. Next year will be the 50th anniversary of that march. It's pretty wild. And interesting enough, just one of my schoolmates, one of the guys I was friendly with in high school, is now a major leader in the African American community. Is Reverend Al Sharpton. Al and I are old buddies.
Really?
We grew up together. We demonstrated together, and we run into each other. He's a real important guy right now. He gets on to be on TV and all kinds of stuff, and he has his own MSNBC program now. So I still follow his tweets, but every so often we run into each other, and he still calls me Kaplan. I still call him Sharpton. And people sort of look at us sort of oddly, because we're the least likely of buddies, however we were. But when he decided to, interesting enough, create a Black History course in the school, a bunch of us decided to do similarly and created a Jewish history course. And when Meir Kahana started recruiting to the JDL in the high school that I went to, Tilden High School in Brooklyn, many of us joined initially. I've been going to Soviet Jewry rallies probably since 1966, since I was a kid, a really young kid. It sort of spoke to me. And Meir Kahana sort of focused it in a little bit, but his brand of militarism was not my brand. We all got off on the fact that we had nunchucks for about 3 weeks. And some people stayed, and a lot of people left. And the other great movement that sort of shaped our consciousness at that time wasn't the Soviet Jewry movement, it was the InterGroup movement. Again, Rabbi Weiss referred to it. And that was sort of, just sort of to talk to something that he spoke to about being on the inside and being on the outside. and walking that tightrope between the two worlds. In one of the, right after the shootings at Kent State, I was part of something called the Mobilization Against War, and our job at that particular point was to close up some high schools. Close up the high schools, you get demonstrations, you show that people are outraged. Maybe we could end this crazy war. We were pretty naive. However, it was that rise of popularism, the rise of mainstream elected officials now coming out against the war. It was the rise of it becoming acceptable to question what was going on, as opposed to in the beginning when you were called a commie pinko or something like that. That led to the end of the war. But we had closed up a particular school, and one person decided it was a good thing to do to go climb over a fence and beat up a cop. It's interesting how obviously he could push a cop about as far as he could push. Of course that kid didn't do anything other than get arrested and getting the stuff beat out of him as well. But we thought it was a good thing to do to liberate him and march on the police precinct. We were marching along a particular street in Brooklyn, and in a neighborhood that was heavily Italian, heavily hard hat, blue-collar workers that didn't exactly look at us crazy hippies as their friends. And one young guy that was standing near me was screaming at them and yelling at them, calling them names, and really giving them a hard time. And I sort of walked over to him and said, "Guy," I said, "you don't live around here." "I do. These guys are serious. They're mean. They will beat the bejeebers out of you." He said, "You know," and I used other words, "you gotta stop this. You have no idea what you're doing." And the only thing I accomplished at that point was for him to start yelling at me. And I realized that anger isn't going to get us to where we needed to be, and being on the outside was not necessarily going to be where we needed to be. It was an important thing to have. It's an important part of the puzzle of sustainable change, but it wasn't necessarily going to be where we needed to be. So let me get back to Doha, because sometimes you get opportunities that are very rare in life, and fortunately I get to do some of that stuff. And I was invited to Doha to deliver a paper on the work that I do here in New York, and the model that we use in preventing conflict. I thought it was odd that they're asking me as a rabbi, as a representative of the Jewish community, the official Jewish community of New York, to come there. And some people in the official Jewish community of New York were not pleased, because there is all kinds of politics in any organization. I don't care if, by the way, I don't care if it's the inside or the outside. There's politics in any organization, just how it works. Sometimes you find the most raw politics in the outside. They're less genteel about it. They're less hidden about it. I'll never forget something that happened. I used to run Hillel of New York before I came on and did this stuff. And we were getting some students involved in what's called a NORC, a Naturally Occurring Retirement Community, which we ran an internship program. And we went down to a place called Penn South. Penn South is located between 7th and 8th Avenue, between like 22nd and like 27th Street. It's a high-rise building that's built by a union, International Ladies Garment Workers Union, one of the main unions that came out of the whole garment strike that followed the Triangle Fire. And the ILGW built this housing, and there was a bunch of people living there, older people. And when they used to go into the elevators, one of the social workers told me, when they used to go in the elevators, the Trotskyites would argue with the Stalinists, and the socialists would argue with the Mensheviks. They're fighting battles that were 30 years old, 40 years old, 50 years old. They hadn't given up on fighting those internal battles of the left, realizing they had very, very little impact on the world, but they thought that they wanted to change. So I believe in something called sustainable change. And how do we engage ourselves in sustainable change? But I don't want to venture too far away from this LaGoyim thing. So here I was in Doha, delivered a speech about the work that I do. I started off talking about race racism in America and how the American experiment confronted racism, not always in a good way. And we had to fight a civil war about it, rather bloody, Jim Crow and civil rights movement, where we are today. I talked a little bit about what we do and how we confront the issue of diversity in America. Diversity is an incredibly complex thing in the world we live in. LA is complex in one way. New York has over 250 different ethnic, racial, faith, and other kinds of groups that make up every single day of every single thing that happens in our city, and it's all relatively new. It all started after 1965 when we changed our immigration laws. Because before that, if you were Chinese, you weren't even officially allowed in the country. That's why you have Chinatowns, because those are the people that got in and stayed. Officially, you weren't allowed to live here. Certainly we know about blacks in America. We forget that everyone else, even Jews, when they first came, were considered black. Irish were considered black. Everyone was considered, who wasn't white Protestant, weren't considered part of the mainstream. But we persevered, and America has come to where it is today. Certainly far from perfect, but moving forward. Certainly far from perfect. And when I finished my speech, my talk, and it's like any other speech and any other talk, sometimes you're good and sometimes you're not good. And I was a little nervous because I'm not an academic. And there's a lot of academics also giving papers there. And I haven't written an academic paper in a long time, but I thought I did a pretty good job. And this sweet young man walks over to me. And if I could show you his picture, which I'm sort of sorry I didn't do, but on one hand, on the other hand, I'm not sorry I didn't do it. He was dressed all in what's called a jalabia. It's a long white garment. He's wearing a white keffiyeh, very Saudi looking. The difference is that he was not wearing one of the ropes around the head, because he was in fact an imam from Saudi Arabia, from Riyadh. And he came over to me and started talking to me. He said, I'm having a problem. My problem is that I believe the Quran means certain things. He's talking about how it means love and caring and respect. It doesn't mean the fundamentalism of Al-Qaeda. And he said, I talk about that in the mosque in Riyadh, and I'm getting in trouble. And some people talk about firing me. And I'm willing to take on the battle, but how do you win? How do you get to the other side? How do you persevere through all this? And you always hear that like dual dialogue going on inside your head. I'm going like, whoa, what's going on here? Here's this guy walking over to me that if you saw him walking down the street, you would say Al-Qaeda. You would say this is the person that wouldn't necessarily walk over to a rabbi, a Jewish guy, and talk to him about this kind of stuff. But he walked over to me because he heard something. He heard something in the speech that spoke to him, that turned him on, that said, maybe here's somebody I can talk to. Maybe here's somebody who can mentor me. Maybe here's somebody who can give me a few answers about what I need to do in my world, which is in Saudi Arabia, in probably the most conservative form of Sunni Islam in the world, one of the most controlled societies in the world. And I learned a lot more about Saudis on this trip than I ever thought I would ever do. And he was coming to me as a faith leader from the Jewish community who should have normatively been seen as an enemy. But I was seen as somebody he could talk to. And we talked. We talked about the work that he's doing, and we talked about the challenges that he has. And we talked about other things about who he was and what he's doing, how old he is, how many kids he has, what he'd like to do with himself after this. And then this black minister walked over, happens to be an army chaplain. I thought that was, look what's going on here. It's like, here you have a black army chaplain who happened to have been a disciple of Dr. King. He was in his probably late 60s, early 70s. Rabbi talking to the Saudi guy about where he's going to be and how he's going to get there. And the minister came over because he also felt something during the speech that spoke to him. And he saw me talking to the Saudi guy, and he decided to enter into the conversation. And he started talking, the black minister started talking about Dr. King and about the type of organizing that Dr. King engendered. It wasn't all the demonstrations, and it wasn't all the big marches on Washington. That was part of it. But it was the knocking on the doors, the getting people to register for the vote, the being arrested, but that wasn't even a big part of it. Because the last thing I think this imam wanted to do was get arrested in Riyadh. But the perseverance and sometimes the disappointments that come along with it. And then we talked about the issue of how long it takes to really make a change. And when I speak to Israelis, and I do a lot of training of Israelis as well, there's this word that Israelis, I keep telling them they don't quite understand. And it's their word, and they even have a hand sign for it, sablanut. And anybody speak any Arabic here? So the Arabic word for sablanut is in Palestinians go shwaya shwaya, but it comes from the word sabah, which also means patient. It's the same shorish, same root. And we talked about patience, and we talked about sustainable change, and we talked about how long after he might no longer be able to do this, that it's going to take to make that kind of change in his world, but the perseverance that comes along with it. And when Yael asked me to do this, I said, well, what does it mean to have or LaGoyim? You know, we certainly know that it comes from, you know, the Sefer Yeshayahu. The Navi is talking about the end of times a little bit. Nevi'im are never, you know, they're never talking about one particular time. They're talking about what's going to happen. They're talking about what's happening. Particularly Yeshayahu, he's living in multiple universes at any one moment, and he's talking about what he's living in at that moment. He's also talking about where he's going and what eventually will happen. And he's also telling us what our responsibility is in the midst of a challenge for us as well. Who are we as a people? How we're going to survive, and it's going to get really bad, and what is going to be our job when we get out there and interface with everyone else? It's going to be, we have to be a light unto the nations. We have to be able to show them what you were talking about before, be an example to them of what it means to travel that road. And how do you travel the adversity of that road? Because the world can be very, very difficult sometimes. How do you travel that adversity of that road? And whether you want to call adversity social justice or whatever you want to call it, and how do you come out the other side fixing a little piece of it? And what does it mean for us as an Am Kadosh, as a holy nation, to get to that point where we can in fact do that and be the person that imam will walk over to and say, you know, I realize you don't look the way I want you to look either. But you're exhibiting something, there's something coming out of you, there's something there that I connect to. Because I'm also trying to connect to that essence, to that world of fixing, that world of spirituality, that world that will go beyond conflict, and I need to find folks that I can connect to that will allow that to happen. So while we may have this ultimate achrayut, the responsibility of being, and that's really what I see as Segula, you know, being a chosen people is the essence of being, having, as we used to say in Yeshiva, achrayus. You know, having that achrayut, having that connectivity to the responsibility, it goes way beyond just us being chosen. It's us being chosen to be responsible for bringing, as the Radak says, the word of God to the world. That's ultimately the Jewish notion. That's who we are. That's our responsibility. We get out of Egypt. We allow ourselves to become, not just to become free, that we could become now connected to or obligated to, you know, the mitzvot as a way of liberation. And I guess not too many people look at it that way. that ultimately, what is mitzvot? It's a pathway to liberation because we're coming closer to God. And as we become liberated through the commission of mitzvot, to becoming connected to God, we're also now connected to His world a little bit more, because if we become connected to God, we become a little bit more connected to the world and a little bit more responsible for it. So we step into it, and that's really what Yeshayahu is talking about, is as we are about to go into Galut for a long period of time, we are now going to be responsible for interfacing with a lot of folks out there and bringing a lot of light into the world. And becoming, as the Navi says, an LaGoyim. How do you go about doing that? What does that mean? It means taking responsibility for what you see around you. And understanding that, as I think as Rabbi Weiss said it, but a little bit different, that you can't do it alone. You have to find other sources of light. Now, it may not be the same light. It may not be this obligated light. It may not be this exalted light. But if there's other sources of light that you have to connect yourself to, particularly when you live, and this is sort of the job that I do, when you're living in a diverse world, you have to find people that can also illuminate darkness. So to become very practical, when I began my work after a very dark period in Jewish history here in New York City. There was riots in Crown Heights. Jews and blacks were really going at each other. It was not a happy period of time between the African American and the Jewish community, and it sort of played itself out in a very disastrous way in Crown Heights. There was all kinds of stuff that happened before then. There was Louis Farrakhan, there was Nation of Islam, there was Khalid Abdul Muhammad, who was his counterpart, who was even more radical than Farrakhan. There was folks like Leonard Jeffries. It was really the aftermath of the militarizing of the Black Liberation Movement, and Jews were seen as a problem. We were seen as a particular problem because we were interfacing with blacks all the time, because neighborhoods that had once upon a time been primarily Jewish, like Crown Heights, were now primarily black. And it happened all over the city. It's sort of ironic now that Harlem was once a Jewish community, became a black community, it's now becoming Jewish again. It's sort of freaky. Different kind of Jews. Different kind of Jews. So when we had to fix that problem, when I was asked to take on this position in the center of the Jewish community, working for as the establishment, and I had made a decision to work for the establishment because I decided to be on the inside. Because I personally believe, and I have a little bit different thing as I call it centrist activism, that when you're on the inside and you can get the inside to accommodate some of this stuff that's coming from the outside and be comfortable with it, you have sustainable change. Because only when the inside accepts the change can it be sustainable. So just to answer something you said before, what happens if YCT becomes the inside? I can only guarantee you one thing. There's a whole mess of that outside right there right now. The inside's really big. The inside of the Orthodox community is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. The birth rate is just unbelievable. I don't know if you have any idea just what goes on and how big it becomes. I lived in Flatbush for 25 years of my life. I studied in Berlin. It's sort of the real, stark black hat world. These guys, they couldn't give a hoot what you think. I'm just letting you know that. So doesn't mean you don't. It's not that you shouldn't be doing it. It isn't that you shouldn't be doing the Maharat thing or everything else which is happening. But you got to realize what you're up against. And how do you speak to them? It's only when you can learn to speak to them and combine your light with their light, because they got a whole lot of light too. It may be a little shadowed right now, but they got a whole lot of light. I remember being in Berlin when I was studying there, and it was sort of a really weird world for me at first, but I got sort of comfortable with it after a while. the Rosh Yeshiva describing to me like you were in the engine room of battleship. It was just the hum of the engine when you're davening with 5,000 folks on a Shabbat in a yeshiva. It's like, now, obviously I chose not to stay there for lots of reasons. But back to how you go about doing it. So when I started to look at what was laid in front of me as my particular job of tikkun olam, which is an oft-used word, and I think that I heard somebody say it the other day, it's sort of funny. How do you say tikkun olam in Hebrew? Because we use it so often, we forgot what it means. And I don't think half the people that use it really understand what it means. When I was given that little, my place to fix by the official Jewish community, and the way they did it was typical of the Jewish community. They had a problem, so they put together a committee. There's a committee of committees, and they came up with another idea to have another committee that was going to then have a grant, and the grant was going to last 3 years, and you were going to fix the problem. And that was really it. And it seemed interesting to me. So I threw my hat in the ring, and as they say, Baruch Hashem, I got hired to do this for a 3-year grant 20 years ago. And when I began to look at what stood in front of me, I understood that our whole notion of diversity was radically different than everyone thought it was. Because folks sometimes don't even look on the outside. They don't listen to really what's happening outside of themselves. One of the most important things you need to do in the work that we are engaged in is to listen. The other night, about 2-3 weeks ago, there was one of the groups that we work with. It's called the New York City Clergy Roundtable. It came out of some of the trainings that we do, and I'll talk about the trainings in a little bit. Headed by a Reverend Pastor Q. English, held a mayoral forum where they put together a spiritual covenant that they wanted these mayoral candidates to sign on to. And it dealt with immigration, it dealt with poverty, it dealt with public safety, it dealt with other major issues in the world. We spent like 6 months putting it together. And because I work for a consensus organization, we don't get involved in the actual policy end of it. But I was able to give a prayer before we started. And it was done in typical fashion. Imam, priest, rabbi, minister. I get up there and I said to them, the essence of Judaism is in our main prayer, or our main statement. It's Hear, O Israel, Shema Yisrael. And it starts with that word Shema, to listen. So it's not about what you're going to be talking about tonight. It's about what listening is going to happen here. Who's going to listen to who? And when you hear somebody, how do you really truly listen and bring it to that next stage of turning listening into activity? Because that's really, if it starts at Shema, then we go in and learn the rest of the Torah. We go in and do all this stuff. So how do we hear people, truly hear them for where they're at, what they're all about, what they truly need, not walking in presupposing all the time who and what they are and what they really need. How do we truly listen to them? So when I was confronted by this, and we were confronted by this, the tools that we had at our hand for intergroup relations back then, the terminology I don't even like anymore, was dialogue work or basketball or concerts or food. And I said, gee, that's real good. It gets people to the table, they talk to each other, it cools things off, but it doesn't sustainably change how they interface with each other. And if I'm looking to do this right, if we're looking to do this right, we really have to see what the root causes are of the conflict. And as we began to listen to people, we understood that we needed to get people to the table to talk about how they can actually trust each other, how they can solve problems with each other. So we chose areas like healthcare. Healthcare was a real biggie. Because when people, new immigrant populations in particular, would walk into a hospital, the horror story that we used to tell back in the early 90s, that doesn't happen anymore, by the way. because of some of the work that we did, not because of just us, but some of the work that we did, was that the 80-year-old Chinese grandmother would walk into a hospital in Queens, and she had some sort of gynecological issues, and there'd be no one to translate from Chinese into English, and who would be the translator would be her 10-year-old nephew. Pretty horrible. Or the story of the Russian that so depressed by the immigration that had attempted suicide, and when the psychiatrist is speaking to them, these are both true stories, by the way, when the psychiatrist is speaking to them, they get on the TTY phone. That was one step up already, these translation phones, and the first question the psychiatrist or mental health professional asks when somebody tries to commit suicide, if I can try it again. It's the first thing you want to know. And they give a long answer in Russian, and the person who's doing the translation says, I don't think so. And it's like, I don't need that. I need real translation. I really need you to be trained on how to handle this. So we began to bring people to the table around healthcare. And we began to do it around access, around language, around culture, and all these different things. And people came to the table because they needed that. They didn't need to sit and talk about how much I hate you or how much I love you. They needed to talk about what really affected their lives, what affected their children, their parents, their kids, their grandparents, and it worked. We kept forming these different coalitions around town, and they were very multi-stakeholder coalitions. It included the hospitals, the HMOs, the government, community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, folks that wouldn't normally sit at the same table together because it was not right to sit at the same table. If you are an activist from the community, why sit at the table with the enemy? The enemy is the hospital. They treat us wrong. And our argument was, if you're going to really change, you have to have those who needed to do the change, part of the change. And if you're going to walk into this, I need you to change this way, they're going to say, okay, nice to hear, but I don't really feel like it. Besides, I don't like being yelled at. I don't like being lectured. Interesting enough, we learned a very powerful lesson from somebody early on from the hospital. We formed a coalition that really needed to hire its own executive director, and we started looking for money. And we realized hospitals got a lot of money, so we sat down with one hospital and we said, maybe you want to be part of this coalition, and if you give us this contribution, we will make you part of the coalition. And a friend of mine who ran the outreach for the hospital wrote the check really quickly, and I said to him, Jeff, it's not that I'm upset about you writing the check, but why'd you write the check? And he said, we got to understand something, that we have just bought a new hospital in Queens where there's a whole lot of Chinese, Koreans, and South Asians. We have not been able to get into that community with a level of trust. But you guys seem to have formed a coalition that seemed to have their trust. Now, I've also spent a lot of money on new equipment because we just got a license to do cardiac surgery. If I get one patient out of this contribution, it pays for it 5 times over. Matter of fact, I'm planning on getting 20 patients out of this, maybe 30 or 40, and learning how to go about doing it. And that's exactly what happened. But he taught me I needed to understand what was the needs, not only of the patients being served, but I also needed to understand what was the needs of the system. Systems had needs too. All these people had needs, to listen to that and to be able to form these coalitions.